The biblical tale of David and Goliath is among the most recognizable stories of triumph against overwhelming odds. This narrative centers on a young shepherd who defeats a fearsome warrior of extraordinary size. However, scholars and religious enthusiasts have long debated whether Goliath was merely an unusually large human or if he belonged to the mysterious biblical race known as the Nephilim. This question invites exploration of ancient texts, folklore, and various theological interpretations that seek to classify the giant of Gath within the broader context of biblical mythology and history. According to the biblical account in 1 Samuel 17, Goliath was a Philistine warrior from Gath who challenged the Israelite army to single combat. The text describes him as a formidable figure standing 6 cubits and a span tall, approximately 9 feet 9 inches in modern measurements, though some ancient manuscripts record his height as 4 cubits and a span, or about 6 feet 9 inches. Goliath wore impressive armor weighing 5,000 shekels of bronze and carried a spear with a head weighing 600 shekels of iron. His imposing stature and equipment made him an intimidating opponent that terrified King Saul's army, with no warrior willing to face him until young David volunteered and ultimately defeated him using only a sling and stone. The Nephilim, in contrast, are mentioned briefly but mysteriously in Genesis 6:4 as heroes of old, men of renown, who were the offspring of unions between the sons of God and the daughters of humans. The Hebrew word Nephilim itself derives from the root nephil, meaning to fall or to make fall, which some interpret as referring to fallen angels or to those who cause others to fall in battle. A later reference in Numbers 13:33 describes the Nephilim as giants encountered by Israelite spies in Canaan, saying, "We saw the Nephilim there, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." These sparse biblical mentions have fueled centuries of speculation about their true nature and whether their lineage continued throughout biblical history. Folklore surrounding giants in the ancient Near East extends beyond biblical accounts, with numerous cultures documenting tales of superhuman beings of extraordinary size. The Epic of Gilgamesh, Hittite myths, and various Canaanite stories all feature giant figures who often represent primordial chaos or extraordinary strength. In Greek mythology, the Titans and later the giants fought against the Olympian gods, creating a pattern of giant beings challenging established order that parallels the biblical David and Goliath narrative. These cross-cultural references suggest that stories of giants held significant symbolic value in the ancient world, often representing forces that must be overcome by heroes representing divine favor or cunning intelligence. Those who argue that Goliath was indeed a Nephilim point to several textual clues. First, the description of his unusual height aligns with biblical descriptions of other giants who were explicitly connected to the Nephilim. Second, 2 Samuel chapter 21, 15-22 mentions other Philistine giants from Gath, including one with 6 fingers on each hand, suggesting a lineage of unusual beings. Third, some biblical genealogies trace certain giant clans like the Anakim, Rephaim, and Amim back to the pre-flood world, potentially connecting them to the Nephilim mentioned in Genesis. These theorists suggest that some Nephilim bloodlines survived the Great Flood, possibly through Ham's lineage, eventually producing giant descendants, including the Philistine warriors like Goliath. A significant challenge to the Nephilim theory involves reconciling Goliath's existence with the biblical account of the Great Flood. According to Genesis, God sent the deluge specifically to cleanse the earth of wickedness, which some interpretations suggest included eradicating the Nephilim and their corrupting influence. The text states that only Noah's family survived, seemingly eliminating any direct Nephilim lineage. This apparent contradiction has led to several theological explanations. Some propose that certain Nephilim somehow survived the flood despite biblical assertions to the contrary. Others suggest a second incursion of sons of God after the flood producing new Nephilim, while still others argue that Nephilim genes might have been carried recessively through Noah's daughters-in-law. These explanations attempt to bridge the narrative gap between the antediluvian Nephilim and post-flood giants like Goliath, though each raises additional theological questions about divine purpose in the flood narrative. Another argument for Goliath's Nephilim heritage comes from examining patterns in biblical narrative. Throughout the Old Testament, the Israelites repeatedly encounter and defeat remnants of giant clans, from the conquest of Canaan through the monarchy period. These confrontations often symbolize Israel's divine mandate to reclaim the promised land from corrupted lineages. Proponents suggest that David's victory over Goliath represents a continuation of this theme, with David as God's anointed confronting a descendant of the unholy union between divine and human beings. This interpretation frames the battle as not merely a military confrontation, but a cosmic struggle between the divine order represented by Israel and the chaotic forces represented by the Nephilim bloodlines. Skeptics of the Nephilim connection offer several counter-arguments based on textual analysis and historical context. They note that the biblical text never explicitly identifies Goliath as a Nephilim, instead simply calling him a Philistine champion. The Philistines were a known historical people group, likely of Aegean origin, who settled in the coastal regions of Canaan around the 12th century BCE. Archaeological evidence suggests they were indeed physically larger than the average Israelite of the time due to better nutrition and possibly genetic factors, but not supernaturally so. These scholars argue that Goliath's impressive size could be explained through normal human variation, perhaps exaggerated in the telling to heighten the drama of David's victory. Medical explanations offer another perspective questioning Goliath's supposed Nephilim heritage. Some researchers suggest that Goliath may have suffered from a medical condition such as gigantism, or acromegaly caused by a pituitary tumor. This theory finds support in the biblical description of Goliath's slow movement and David's ability to outmaneuver him, potentially indicating the poor coordination and limited peripheral vision often associated with these conditions. The text's mention of Goliath's need for a shield-bearer who walked before him might further suggest visual impairment. If true, this would place Goliath firmly within the realm of unusual but entirely human medical conditions rather than supernatural origin. Textual critics also point to variations in ancient manuscripts regarding Goliath's height. While the Masoretic text describes him as over 9 feet tall, the earlier Septuagint and Dead Sea Scrolls versions list him at approximately 6 feet 9 inches, certainly tall for the time, but not supernaturally so. This discrepancy suggests possible scribal exaggeration over time, a common phenomenon in ancient literature where heroic tales tend to grow more impressive with retelling. From this perspective, the extraordinary height attributed to Goliath in later manuscripts may reflect theological and literary development rather than historical reality, casting further doubt on any connection to the Nephilim. Some theological interpretations frame the David and Goliath narrative as primarily symbolic rather than literal, focusing on its message about faith overcoming seemingly insurmountable challenges. In this reading, Goliath's gigantic stature serves as a literary device emphasizing the odds against David rather than a claim about Nephilim ancestry. The story's emphasis on David's rejection of conventional armor and weapons in favor of divine assistance suggests that the narrative's primary concern is theological rather than genealogical. From this perspective, debates about Goliath's potential Nephilim heritage miss the point of the text, which focuses on divine power working through the faithful rather than the specific nature of the enemy. The question of whether Goliath was a Nephilim ultimately remains unresolved due to limited historical evidence and the interpretive nature of ancient texts. The biblical narrative provides tantalizingly incomplete details about both Goliath and the Nephilim, creating space for ongoing speculation and debate. What seems clear is that Goliath functioned within the biblical narrative as an embodiment of overwhelming opposition. Whether this opposition was supernatural in origin or merely humanly formidable likely mattered less to ancient audiences than the message that faith in divine providence could overcome even the most intimidating adversaries. This ambiguity continues to fuel fascination with these ancient stories and their mysterious figures. While compelling arguments exist both for and against classifying Goliath as a descendant of the Nephilim, the evidence remains circumstantial and subject to interpretation. The question touches on broader issues of how we read ancient texts, balancing literal and symbolic interpretations, historical context, and theological significance. Perhaps the enduring power of the David and Goliath story lies precisely in this ambiguity, allowing it to function simultaneously as a historical account of an underdog victory, a theological statement about divine favor, and a potential glimpse into mysterious beings at the edges of biblical cosmology. Whether Goliath was indeed a remnant of the enigmatic Nephilim or simply an extraordinarily large human warrior, his role in one of history's most enduring narratives ensures that the question will continue to captivate scholars and believers alike for generations to come.